Good evening. My name is Carolina Powell. Welcome to my capstone presentation. I am a senior in Penn State's World Campus in their Energy and Sustainability major. Every senior, before they graduate, gets to take part in a large project such as this one. This is a semester's worth of work accumulating in this video, so I appreciate you being here with me. Now, this original presentation was done in front of a panel of oil and gas employees. So we do focus a lot on why a natural gas severance tax might not be beneficial. But if you're watching this on YouTube, feel free to put in a question or a comment, and I'll be more than happy to discuss the other side in more depth. So let's get started. So this is a map of the 50 states and the oil and gas severance tax laws. The dark blue, as you can see, which are the majority of them, have existing oil and gas severance tax laws on the books. Then you have the medium blue, such as Alaska, Ohio, West Virginia, which have a severance tax laws on the books, but they're amending legislation at this current point. Then you also have the light blue, such as Pennsylvania, which does not have any severance tax laws on the books at all currently, but is in the middle of proposing one. Then you have very few states that are in white that are not taking part in the severance tax laws. So, as we look at this map and proceed forward, it's important to understand the role of Pennsylvania and the natural gas history in the state's history, so that we can better understand why Pennsylvania does not currently have a severance tax and why it really wants one. So there are three big arguments for a severance tax in Pennsylvania. One, other states have them, so why not? Two, the state needs revenue. Our education is underfunded according to a lot of the public, and therefore we need to tax something, and why not the natural gas industry? And three, natural gas, such as other fossil fuels, is bad for the environment, so we should tax them higher than other possible green energies in order to help green energy come in. So this presentation is going to discuss a few things. We're going to first start with what a severance tax is. Then we're going to go into the history of Pennsylvania's natural gas industry. Then we're going to discuss the current proposal, House Bill 2103, and the history of why it suddenly has come up. And then we're going to discuss the current laws on the books, that are the impact fees, the economic impact that would occur if severance taxes were actually made law, and then we're going to discuss some recommendations for how to possibly avoid doing a severance tax and still fund our needs. So let's get started. So what is a severance tax? So a severance tax exchanges a permanent withdrawal of resources of value for revenue to the government. So it pays the citizens of a state or a country for the permanent withdrawal of natural resources. Therefore, we think of coal, we think of iron, we think of obviously oil and natural gas as big industries in the that would be subject to the severance tax. However, we also have other resources that are just not as easily renewable, such as timber and fisheries, that are also subject to severance tax in some areas. So as we've seen, a majority of the states, actually 36 of them, have a severance tax, but only in 6 states does the tax make up a big chunk of revenue. There's actually only 6 states where it makes up more than 10.5%, with Alaska being the largest at 74.3% of Alaska's mix. Now, if you noticed, on the map, Alaska actually was proposing amending its legislation. Currently, oil and gas prices are very low, and Alaska depends heavily on its fossil fuels severance tax. So it is trying to figure out how to get more revenue from lower prices. So Pennsylvania's current proposal is known as House Bill 2103. It was introduced in May of 2016 and is currently sitting in the Committee of Environmental Resources and Energy for review. The bill actually proposes a tax of various rates dependent on natural gas prices. Originally, the severance tax that was proposed wanted to do a set percentage rate no matter what the prices were. And the giant argument against that was, well, when prices are $9 an MCF, 1,000 cubic feet, we can afford it, but when they're $1, we can't afford that sort of tax rate. So this was the compromise that was come up with against that argument. So when prices are 0 to less than $1 per 1,000 cubic feet, then it's a tax of 4%, all the way up to a tax of 9% when prices are $5 or more. Current market conditions would usually put it between 5 and 6, although there are days such as today where it would fall under the 7%. Now the important thing to note is who this proposal would benefit. This tax will fund the Pennsylvania Public School Employees Retirement System. Then once that is funded, it will fund the state employees retirement system. Governor Wolf, who was the big proponent of this severance tax, wanted to fund education using it. So this is a slight twist on that, but we will discuss it further and why it's quite ingenious when we discuss our interview with the sponsor of the bill later on in the presentation. So these are the co-sponsors of the bill. The main sponsor is Representative Sterla from Lancaster. But there are some important things to note here. First of all, there are only two Republicans, Republican Harry Lewis Jr. and Republican Jack Rader Jr. So this is not a very bipartisan friendly proposal. The other part is where these representatives come from, or what parts of the state they represent. The only areas that really have any drilling going on that are close to it are Allegheny and possibly Erie County. And there's not a whole lot of drilling going on right in the center of Allegheny where Pittsburgh is. So to better illustrate this, the red dots are unconventional wells, and this map was pulled right from the Pennsylvania Department of Environmental Protection. So the red dots are where there's drilling currently going on, and the blue dots are where the co-sponsors of the bill are from. So as you can see, most of these representatives that are sponsoring this bill are not from areas where the natural gas industry is booming. This presents an issue with passing the severance tax bill because it makes people in the industry and also in areas where the economy is being helped by the industry concerned that the people outside are really just attempting to get extra revenue and hurt their economy instead. So let's kind of talk about what the sponsors of the bill are doing next session in order to help fix that. So let's discuss the history of natural gas in Pennsylvania. So the first commercially successful oil well was drilled near Titusville, which is northwest Pennsylvania, in 1859 by Colonel Edward Drake. Fun fact, Edward Drake was actually not a colonel. It's just a title he gave himself in his letters when writing to the town, thinking that they would be happier that he was there if he gave himself a fancy title. So not long after, in 1878, a natural gas field was discovered outside of Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. On November 3rd, a well was drilled, and following the discovery, natural gas was run to the city of Pittsburgh, and it was the first major city supplied with the newly discovered fuel. If you are in the oil and gas industry and have run companies such as the Natural Gas Company of West Virginia, which is common around this time frame at the courthouses, that was one of the first companies to supply this fuel to Pittsburgh. However, the newly found fuel did not support in Pennsylvania for very long. There's a large shift to Texas after the discovery of Spindletop in 1901. This was known as the Gusher and took most of the industry down there with it. Very quickly after 1901, just a few short years, Texas enacted a severance tax on oil and gas. So as we mentioned, Pennsylvania really did lack production in 1900, so the severance tax was not really on anybody's mind because there was not a lot of revenue coming from that industry. The first hydraulic fractured well was done on the Barnett Shale in Texas, however, and then when it was finally moved to Pennsylvania, that's when it really started to make a difference. In 2003, the first hydraulically fractured well was fracked in Pennsylvania. It was done in Washington County, which is in southwest Pennsylvania, and it really brought the state to the forefront of production. Pennsylvania actually overtook Texas as the largest natural gas producer by 2012. So the Marcellus Shale, which is the shale underneath Pennsylvania, part of New York, part of West Virginia and Ohio, it's estimated to hold as much as 500 trillion cubic feet of natural gas. If you take out just 10% of that figure, it's enough to supply the United States for all of its demand for 7 years. So that is a lot of natural gas found underneath our state. So as we kind of discussed, very flat, very small production in Pennsylvania. Then in 2003 here, the Washington County well is fracked, and it's the first well fracked in Pennsylvania. And then we start taking off pretty steeply afterward. 2010 is when Governor Corbett, who is a big proponent of the natural gas industry, stepped into office. So as we saw the increase in the industry in the state, we also started to see a large economic impact that was brought with, a positive impact that was brought with the industry. The industry employed as many as 250,000 workers at one point, when counting ancillary industries, such as trucking and hospitality. These industries also grew, even though they weren't just the drillers themselves, because the industry brought in a lot of out-of-staters, and that had to be supported in hotels, for example, and then trucks obviously had to bring equipment back and forth, and there was plenty of other industries that were positively impacted by it. If you've ever been to a courthouse in a boom town, you see that subway has a line out the door most lunch days. So this would have been a impact of the natural gas industry. However, Governor Wolf's current labor department does not include the 29 supporting industries, and thus states the amount of employees in the natural gas industry is less than 30,000. This is very important to understand when looking at reports, because when discussing a severance tax that might negatively impact an industry or cause a loss in labor in the industry, you're going to get a much different number when you're talking about the impact on 30,000 employees than you are when talking about the impact on 250,000 employees. So when reading reports, ensure that you are aware of where in time and what was going on, that the reporting would be factored. So in 2008, the oil and gas industry paid $38.8 million in Pennsylvania state taxes, and the late 2000s started to see lots of discussions and arguments regarding a severance tax. Unlike the early 1900s, where there was no revenue coming in, there was starting to really be a boom in the state. So therefore, representatives and the public really did start wanting to get their piece of the pie. However, Patrick Henderson of the Pennsylvania Senate's Environmental Resources and Energy Committee stated, I think long ago, lawmakers decided they wanted to encourage the industry, not tax it to death. It's very difficult to tell little towns such as Williamsport, Pennsylvania, that suddenly were growing and coming out of the Depression quicker than every other town, that they would tax the industry significantly more and thereby possibly cause them not to have as much of a positive economic impact. Governor Corbett, who was elected in 2010, also promised no new taxes on the industry, and drilling really did expand while he was in office. If you can see this little table, in 2009 there was 807 wells drilled in the state. In 2010 we had almost double at 1,575. Then in 2011 we go up to 1937. So we're starting to see large increases in natural gas production and wells drilled. Therefore, in 2012, a compromise was made. We didn't do a severance tax, but we enacted an impact fee. So an impact fee, instead of a percentage, instead of percentage on production, it's a fee on wells drilled. So for every well that Chesapeake, who was a large Pennsylvania driller, drilled, or any other driller drilled, there would be a set price. So in a brand new well, if natural gas prices were above $3, the company would pay $50,000. Now, as the well got older, because of depletion, the price of the impact fee would go down up till $10,000 at the age of 15. The reason that the impact fee was quite successful, and it was actually taken quite well by the natural gas industry, was that a majority of it went to the local government. Therefore, the places that had to repair extra roads because of the extra amount of traffic, hire extra firemen and police workers in order to patrol the amount of new people that came into the area, they were able to do that. So more than half of the revenue from the impact fee goes to the local government. Then it goes to state agency oversight, which is the DEP that we spoke about. Make sure that all permits are followed, all state regulations are followed. It gets us that nice map of where all the drilling is occurring. And then we have counties and state environmental parks and bridges. So it really did do a lot of what a severance tax is supposed to be. A severance tax is supposed to help for the environmental, help pay for the environmental impact that that taking out a bunch of these natural resources does. And so it does, so this impact fee did pay to help lower that environmental impact. However, in 2014, Wolf did win the election. Unfortunately for Corbett, Pennsylvania's felt that a severance tax used to fund education would be a great idea, and that was a large platform of Wolf's. Wolf argued that several other states had a severance tax, and so Pennsylvania should as well. And he also argued that education needed reform and needed more money, so the natural gas industry should be the industry to pay. Those are two of the big three arguments that we hear when discussing why natural gas tax should be enacted. Polls agreed with Wolf. So polls showed a strong support for natural gas, not only drilling, but also for a severance tax. Now, if you kind of take that into consideration, that sounds counterintuitive. How can the average person be for the natural gas industry and yet want to tax them additionally? However, it has been shown in studies that it is very easy to pass a tax to help fund good ideas to education if the tax does not impact the individual themselves. So for example, I don't smoke. So if somebody told me, let's add a $10 tax to cigarettes and help save the pandas, I'd say sure, why not? So this is kind of what you're getting here, is people like the natural gas industry. The state realizes that it's a large economic driver, but people would rather have the natural gas industry pay for the taxes than they would themselves, or have an increase in sales tax. However, what's very interesting is if you start adding negative words to the end of that poll sentence, so instead of saying, would you support a severance tax, where the majority of people agree, if you ask, would you support a natural gas severance tax that might cost jobs and have a negative economic impact, less than a quarter of Pennsylvanians agree to that. So that kind of shows you how not everybody might be thinking of the full economic impact that a severance tax might possibly have. However, so Wolf wins the election. Immediately after the election, he pushes for a bill that would impose a 5% tax on the value of natural gas, plus a 4.7-cent fee for every 1,000 cubic feet of gas. This is very similar to West Virginia. As we know, this does not get passed, and instead we get House Bill 2103. Now, a lot of people do not like the fact that it's a flat 5% and a flat fee, because it is much more expensive and a larger percentage of production costs when natural gas prices are very low. So instead, we get that sliding scale that we saw in House Bill 2103. Okay, so we had the great pleasure of speaking to Representative Sterla from Lancaster. He is the main sponsor of the bill. He actually called me up at like 7:15 p.m., heard I was writing a paper and have been bugging everybody in his office to give me some answers, so thought he would personally give me a call, which I was obviously flattered about. So I asked him, I said, why do we need a severance tax? We have the impact fee, People are generally happy with the impact fee, at least around here in Washington County. Why do we need to change? So his exact quote was, "Everyone would be up in arms if the area around King of Prussia Mall decided the sales tax paid there only stayed in the area instead of going to the state. So why should this be any different?" So if you know anything about sales tax, if you pay it, whether it's in Philadelphia, Pittsburgh, or anywhere, it goes to a general fund and it gets distributed throughout the state. Therefore, areas such as where I am, where really there's not much going on, we still get revenue even though we don't have a major mall such as the King of Prussia Mall. So this is a very valid argument. People like the impact fee because the revenue really stays mostly in the area impacted, but I mean, people around King of Prussia Mall, they have more traffic to deal with, they have to have more firemen, more policemen because they have added populations. So you can make some of the same arguments for sales tax. So why should one be different than the other? So the argument is actually quite valid. When asked whether when talking about our competition and whether it was possible that the industries would go over to Ohio and West Virginia, which also have the Marcellus Shale, if we enacted a high severance tax, his response was, "We have so much of it, natural gas, that oil and gas drillers, would not go away." He seemed very confident. He spoke of meetings where he sat down with Exxon and a few other large drillers, and they said they had a tax already put into their profit. So sure, they can afford some tax. Therefore, then he also mentioned, hey, Governor Wolf needs revenue to fund education. And this is where I thought he was really brilliant. If you remember, we originally spoke about how House Bill 2103 does not directly fund education, but it funds the state employees' pension and the school pensions. Why is that important? So in Representative Sterla's logic, if you fund the pension liabilities for the school district, well, then that frees up the school district to fund more education. So you really do hit Governor Wolf's goal of giving more revenue to education, but you also have more voters now wanting this. Not only do you have people with kids and people in school districts that want a severance tax, but now you also have people who benefit from the pension plan because their pensions are going to be paid for. So why not increase the amount of support you have for this bill while also meeting your original goal? Quite interesting and very brilliant on their part. However, we do have to think about the impact of a severance tax. As we discussed, 3 arguments for a severance tax, 2 really largely proposed by Governor Wolf. Other states have a severance tax, so Pennsylvania needs to have one. We need more revenue to fund education, so we need to tax somewhere, so might as well tax natural gas. And 3, natural gas, it's a fossil fuel. You get it by fracking. This is all bad for the environment. We need to tax them so people stop using fossil fuels and move on to green energies. However, we make the argument that other states have a severance tax, so Pennsylvania needs one too. However, Pennsylvania also has a high corporate tax rate. It's 9.99%, which makes us second in the country for highest corporate tax rate. And other states, like Texas, which enacted that severance tax long ago, has a 0% corporate tax rate. So is it really fair to make drillers here pay 10% plus a severance tax fee plus an impact fee? Because the current House Bill 2103 does not get rid of the impact fee, it tacks on a severance tax on top of it. Okay? Additionally, severance tax would lower royalties for landowners. If you only have so much profit, let's say you're just completely making it up, let's say you have 30% net profit after you pay your drilling costs, and you have to pay a 5% severance tax fee, well then you're not going to be paying anybody a royalty of 20% because that leaves you with very little profit. You're going to lower that royalty fee. The royalty fee is what the landowner that you're drilling on or drilling under is getting paid. Why does that seem counterintuitive? Isn't a severance tax supposed to pay the citizens for their natural resources? Now you're paying the landowner whose natural resources you are taking less? Not sure that that's a wise move. It would also, there was multiple economic studies. One study said that wells drilled would be reduced by 1364 in just 1 year. If we remember, in 2010 we had only drilled 1,500 wells, so you're basically removing a whole year's worth of drilling in a year. This 1364 loss in wells would be a loss of 18.2 billion in natural gas and 18,000 lost jobs by 2025. Now, interesting note, this economic study assumed that if a severance tax was put into place, the impact fee would be repealed. Remember, our current bill just tacks it on, so these economic impacts could actually be even worse. Another economic study tried to figure out whether the cost of an additional tax would be passed on to the consumers, being the family that uses natural gas. And it found that the average family would pay an additional $100 in utility bills, which is quite significant when you think about the price of natural gas right now. So then we continue. This is a very interesting table. It's the tax collections in 2012 of the natural gas industry. So if you look, we kind of discussed the corporate tax rate. So from the natural gas industry in 2012, Pennsylvania brought in $1.8 million in corporate tax income. And as we discussed, Texas does not have a corporate tax rate, so it's 0. And nobody else really even comes close. Once again, one of the highest corporate tax rates in the country. And then we look at the severance tax or the impact fees. So Pennsylvania from impact fees brought in $202 million, whereas Ohio brought in $10 million from the severance tax. So this table just kind of shows you that even though other states may have a severance tax, this doesn't necessarily mean they're paying more in taxes. So in 2016, Ohio announced that a severance tax would top $30 million. And a drilling watchdog spokeswoman for them said, wow, that's pretty amazing. And this article is really excited for the amount of revenue this would bring to the state. However, it also mentioned that Pennsylvania would bring in $856 million from the natural gas industry, more than 100 of that being from the impact fee. I would much rather have $100 million over $30 million. So I'm not necessarily sure that just enacting a severance tax really, because other states have one, really does much for us. If we go back to this slide, let's look at another neighbor. Let's look at West Virginia. So in 2012, West Virginia brought in $3 billion, $3.8 billion from the natural gas industry. West Pennsylvania brought in $21.6 billion. Once again, no severance tax. The natural gas industry in Pennsylvania pays more in taxes than in West Virginia. So the third large argument for a severance tax is that we should tax the environmentally unfriendly, basically making it more expensive for people to use fossil fuels and for drillers to turn a profit in order to quickly transition into green energy. However, natural gas produces half the carbon dioxide of coal. Due to hydraulic fracturing alone, carbon emissions dropped by 3.8% in 2012. So do you really want to be taxing something that is making such a significant impact and thereby making it more expensive and less in demand? Also, environmentalists do not necessarily want a severance tax on natural gas. One environmentalist said, it entrenches the gas industry even more firmly in the tax base, making Pennsylvania citizens dependent on the revenue to fund key institutions like education. If it is a large amount of our tax revenue, it will not be as easily to transition to other sources such as solar or wind or other green energies. Okay. So where is this tax heading? The bill is actually not likely to come to a vote this session. We only have a few weeks left before everybody adjourns for Christmas. However, next session's sponsor, according to Representative Sterla, is Representative Jim Cristiano. Now, why is that bad? Jim Cristiano, unlike all the other co-sponsors we saw, is a Republican. So now there's actually bipartisan support, which makes it a little easier to try to pass it through the House. And then he also represents part of Washington County and Beaver County. If you recall our large map, Washington County is actually where the first fracked well in Pennsylvania happened, and Beaver County is 2 counties to the north of that. So it is a place where there's a lot of drilling going on. So now you no longer get that argument by the natural gas industry that, oh, these are just outsiders trying to get extra revenue from the places where drilling is occurring. So, unfortunately, I did not get a chance to speak to Representative Jim Christiana, so these thoughts are really my thoughts. Why would Representative Jim Christiana want to sponsor this bill? First of all, he's also a very large energy supporter. He actually backed the natural gas plant in Beaver County. So why would he? Now, my first thought is possibly he wants to make sure that he can put his thumbprint on the bill, which will make it easier and possibly not as bad for the industry. A second reason possibly that Representative Jim Christiano would want to sponsor this bill is he has sponsored many bills trying to get rid of the property tax. In Pennsylvania, property tax pays for education, pays for the local school districts. So if he wants to get rid of that, he might be in need of another revenue source in order to fund education. So it's possibly a combination of the two, but it's not going to be as easy next session to not pass this bill because you have a Republican now sponsoring it and pushing for it, so Republicans are more apt to listen to it, and you have somebody from the energy parts of the country, the state, pushing for it as well. So he'll definitely get a little more backing from parts where drilling is occurring. So this might spell bad news for those of us who hope that a natural gas tax does not occur. Okay, so what can we do to help? First of all, we obviously know there's more money needed for education. So is it possible to redo the impact fee and cause a part of it to go to local education and schools? That might be one idea. Two, in order to go ahead and try to keep this from being passed, it definitely needs more support from a larger base of people. We need to educate those that are not in the natural gas industry. As we talked about the poll numbers earlier, people who think this will not impact them at all and think it'll just positively impact schools are all for it. But once you start discussing what economic impact it'll have to their energy bills, to their natural gas bills, as well as to possibly the areas around them and jobs, they are much less apt to favor it. We also need to contact the Environmental Resources and Energy Committee Chair, which is Representative John Maher, who represents part of Pittsburgh. Now, what does the Energy Committee Chair do? The chair of a committee decides what gets discussed and what gets put on the schedule. So if Representative John Maher does not wish to look into this bill, it's just going to sit in committee forever. So it's very easy for us to go ahead and send him an email, send him, call his office, and ask for him to not consider this proposal. We also have the Representative Garth Everett, who's the Energy Committee sub-chair. He is already against the severance tax bill, but it's always nice to hear of more people supporting his point of view. Finally, make sure you contact your particular representative and ask them to vote no on any future tax bills for the severance tax. So that concludes the capstone project on the natural gas severance tax bill. Thanks for joining us. I'm going to slowly flip through the references, but if you also leave a comment, if you're watching this on YouTube, I'll be happy to send you the actual paper that goes behind this as well. Feel free to ask any other questions or comments that you may have, and we can go from there. Thanks again for joining me.